And good evening, this is KKUP, Cupertino, 91.5 FM. I am JP Dancing Bear, and of course, that means that this is Out of Our Minds, the weekly hour-long poetry program. I do have a guest in the studio with me, and I will tell you about my guest right now. My guest is a writer, songwriter, storyteller, and lecturer at and poet at Santa Clara University in Silicon Valley. His ebook, Glad to Be Dad, A Call to Fatherhood, is out from Familius.com and will come out as a print book in the spring. He recently placed a full-length poetry collection, Dear Beast Loveliness, which I have in my hand, Poems of the Body, with BlazeVox Press. His children's books have won recognition from the New York Times, NPR, the Smithsonian, Nickelodeon, and others. He's published over 120 poems, won a first place prize in poetry judged by John Updike for his poetry chapbook, won a major prize in science fiction, was nominated for a Pushcart for an essay, and has published much other fiction and nonfiction for children, adolescents, and adults. He won the 2012 SCBWI Magazine Merit Award for Fiction, and the West Coast Songwriters Saratoga Chapter Song of the Year Award. Welcome to Out of Our Minds, Tim Myers.
Thank you, Bear, very much. I appreciate the introduction. I am delighted to be here in what I consider the hallowed, if somewhat strip molly halls of KUP, a station that I have loved ever since I came to California. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. The way we usually start off is to have you read a couple of poems.
I would be delighted. As you said, my new collection is called Dear Beast Loveliness, Poems of the Body. It is the type of poetry volume that is more or less thematically unified. I suppose the body theme is obvious. I'd like to read the opening poem. It's called Portrait of Anyone. I don't think there's anything in here I need to talk about before I read. I believe in doing that if that's necessary. Okay, Portrait of Anyone. At first no more than microscopic pearl descending on dark waters through strange passageways deep in a woman's body, there to be met by ecstatic crowding messengers, each bearing a kind of self. At first, though no more than pale sun surrounded by insistent burrowing stars. This is egg and sperm. This is one of us. And then, eyes looking around, maybe brown, maybe blue flecked with gold, two small round skies that see. If you remove a cell from a living heart, the cell will continue to beat. And me with this tree in my chest that breathes my life, this blood fountain at my center, its innumerable rivers flowing to distant countries all within. And then the meat that thinks, that dreams of roses here behind my eyes. Exactly what stupendous, inaccessible secret of mortality are we? That's the opening song. The opening song, actually, it's not really a mistake to call it a song. I like Walter Pater's little line that poetry conspires or aspires to the condition of music, and I often write in that vein myself. I'm going to read a second one, and this is actually for my son Nick, who is now a strapping 31-year-old who's fought forest fires and worked in the Coast Guard and the rest of it, but at this time had not yet been born. And what happened at the moment then, back then I should say, my wife and I, she was extremely pregnant, we'd gone down to the local public library because the Voyager spacecraft was way out in space on a journey. I believe it was going beyond Saturn, but it had first encountered Saturn's area of influence, whatever you'd call it astronomically. And we went because the spacecraft was actually sending all this sound back through these gulfs of space, and you could hear the sounds that it was recording. So the poem is about that and about the birth of my son, or the soon-to-be birth. For Nick. 2 days after Voyager's robot sensors first gathered the music of Saturn, its toning cry where solar wind meets planetary bowshock, fired back to Earth across 1 billion miles. And we stood in the auditorium to hear over the big speakers its boom and crackle and bell-like moan. 2 days after, I stood by your mother and heard your birthday arrive, fetal monitor transmitting to us from the depths of her body that muffled whooshing of your tiny heart. So tell me, Nick, which was more mysterious, and which came from farther away?
I think probably the best place to start, because the title, after reading the introduction, I'm aware of what the title means, but to others,
good point,
especially in the listening audience who have not picked up the book yet, perhaps you could explain the title of the book.
Absolutely. The first point I should make is that this can be easily remedied by your audience rushing out in droves to buy the book. Then they'll have no problem. Yeah, that's probably one of the most barefaced plugs you've ever had, right?
No, I've had one.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. What am I saying? I'm sure I can't compete.
After 10 years, 12 years on this show, nothing shocks me anymore.
Exactly. Obviously, this experience of the body is something that is fundamental to all of us. I mean, there are very few things that I think we can say about all human beings. I usually avoid absolute generalizations a lot. But in this case, this is something that's fundamental. In some form or another, to be human, you have to have a body. And it's amazing to me how different our interpretations can be based on this universal experience. And so I was naturally drawn to that. I mean, if you pay attention to life, to the world, this is something that poetry is supposed to help us with. You can't help but pay attention to your own physical existence. And one of the things, when you consider the body too, it's clear that there are some wondrous and ecstasy-provoking things about having a body, but there are also some terrible burdens that the limits of flesh and disease and death impose on all of us. So coming to some kind of balance, some kind of philosophical or spiritual balance about that is, to me, one of these basic human life tasks that we all have. But in the title, I think I couldn't help striking the note that when I look back at this book that I think may come through the most, it's a very realistic book. There are poems about terminal disease, and there are poems about death, and there are poems about aging. There's a poem about my own waning abilities as a basketball player, which is funny in some ways and, sad in other. But the overall tone, I think, is this amazing, wondrous experience of having a body. And Beast is there because it's an animal. It's an animal experience. There are aspects of our humanity that are no different from what other higher mammals experience, and even other animals, and yet also we feel such love for our bodies. It's almost, in a way, your best friend in life. And that's not true for everybody. Obviously, bodies often torture people, but that's what it's about. The incredibly beautiful, intense, somehow revelatory experience. And I sense why I'm using that word. I'm not sure if I can explain it. The revelatory sense of having a body and having that experience in the world. That's a long dang answer. Sorry about that. But yeah, that was just a title question, and I went on like that. Forgive me.
No, that's okay. And it's funny because you alluded to something that maybe it was just a subconscious thing. About the universality of most poets addressing at some point the body, as oftentimes it's in its decline, entropy, you might say,
sure,
breaking down, those kinds of things. I'm thinking of the haiku poets who could, compare what they were feeling inside with what was in the outside world. Mm-hmm. In Chinese poets, of course, And actually, that's one of the things in reading this book. I felt as if there was an influence by Chinese poetry, the old Chinese poetry, and I was going to ask you about that.
Very, very interesting observation. Two of my children's books are about Basho. I'm a person who, I don't want to say a fan, I guess that's what we say now, right? I'm a huge fan of Basho. I'm kind of a devotee. And Basho, of course, was very strong on traditional Chinese classical models of poetry, even though he forged a new literary experience by finding the haiku as he did, as the hoku, and then lifting it the way he did. So I imagine it comes through that way. Now, I've read some Chinese, not a lot. I've read some through Ezra Pound. I think I also lived in Japan for 3 years, and modern Japan is not the same as classical Japan, but there is still a lot of that spirit. I mean, just like any culture, its past is still part of its present. And it's interesting you'd say that, Bear, because I can't help but think that sounds like I'm sucking up to you, and I don't mean that, but that seems really astute to me, because these poems on the surface don't look like that kind of poetry, and I write a tremendous amount of haiku. Clearly, some of that is trickled in, and some of that spirit has come through. That's very interesting that you would pull that out. Yeah,
it's funny. I also did notice that there are some really extremely short poems in here.
That's true. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Yeah, they're haiku-like poems. Yeah.
Exactly. And almost to the point where, it's like I'm thinking if you were to read these, you would be like, you'd have to go back and do like they do with haiku, which is read them for a second time, just so that it sinks in.
Right.
I spent some time in haiku as well. It was one of the first places I started off with, and I studied haiku, and a lot of people, I understood what there was a Japanese movement like a century ago in which they basically broke all the traditional stuff down, made one-line haikus, and then most of the people I encounter who are writing haiku in English, it's almost like they're traditionalists. It's almost like they're metered rhyming poets. The way they approach and attack haiku, which is so, it's got to be the 17 syllables. It's got to be 575. Yeah. Oh my God, you broke the cardinal rule.
Right.
And it's like, no, you really haven't paid that much attention, because they were very accepting of these changes that occurred at the turn of the century, and these one-line, maybe 17 syllable, but, just in the translation of the two languages. I mean, there's such a vast difference between those two.
Exactly.
That there's no way that it should be that dogmatic when you come back and try to do haiku in English. Those should be the least bit of things that you worry about.
I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting to me, a lot of times in life in general and in literature, a balanced position and more of a middle ground makes more sense. So, for example, I write a fair amount of metered traditional poetry from the English tradition, and I also write a lot of free verse that's very different. The haiku thing is fascinating, too, because there are great cultural differences between Japan and America, which I experienced firsthand living there. And one is that there is certainly in Japan, and we don't want to overgeneralize, but there certainly is a sense of orderliness and hierarchy that's stronger than American culture is used to. And so some of that's reflected in the traditional Japanese form. And that traditional Japanese form, with all its particulars, like, what is it, the kigu, the season word, and all those things.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful form, and it's a powerful form, and it allowed for the creation of some great haiku. But this is one of those T.S. Eliot tradition and the individual talent kind of issues as far as I'm concerned, because also people can create amazing haiku without following those strictures.
Yeah.
And Basho himself, two things about Basho I think are fascinating. One is that Basho's haiku often violate the exact 17-syllable haiku rule. Mm-hmm. They are a few syllables short or a few syllables long. And I find generations of students, because I often work with children and adults teaching haiku, they in a Procrustean way, they will kill their haiku to cut off 2 syllables or to add 2 syllables, missing the spirit of the haiku.
Right.
And the other thing from Basho is, and this is one of the lines that I quote in my life over and over again, Basho says, "Do not follow in the footsteps of the old masters, seek what they sought," which to me says what haiku is about is a deeper and to me a very spiritual thing, very physical and spiritual simultaneously. And restrictions of form should work, like Frost's old line about playing tennis without a net, if you're not using form, should work to the good of the art, not for their own sake. So I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, there's a haiku I love, a modern haiku. I think it's just fantastic. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the person who did it. The haiku goes like this: "Spring rain, pig and I." And to me, that conjures a beautiful scene. And, of course, it breaks every possible rule of the traditional haiku.
Right. Yeah. Actually, yeah, it does. Except for, well, yeah, because you're
It's
not
short.
even you're not supposed to call out the season.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, all it is short. You know.
But that's, I mean, that's the thing about art. And, you know, it's in a way, I think if you're painting, you have an easier time of being, of breaking the rules and innovating than sometimes with poetry, because I see a lot of people who just are so dogged about certain aspects of poetry.
Yeah.
I still have friends who argue that if it doesn't rhyme in meter, it is just simply not a poem, it's something else. And I just, you know, I don't know how to respond to that, because I just feel like it's that tradition where it's not tradition. I would almost say it's the inability to move.
Well, and, you know, when you look across human culture, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone who's paid any attention at all that there's a dogmatism in various forms.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Now,
I almost refer to formalists as fundamentalists.
well, and that's interesting, because I also think they're free verse fundamentalists, and
Yeah.
I think they're language poet fundamentalists. In other words, the question there is, and the thing is, to a degree, I will more than forgive. I will accept somebody's insistence on form if it comes from the idea that they themselves, using that form, are producing, they believe, their best work. You know, in other words, those forms are usually created and evolved for very strong artistic reasons. Mm-hmm. And the reason they stay with us, just like great folk tales, is because they actually help people do great work.
Right.
But when we see that same principle applied in religion, many of us, and I certainly feel that way, you have found a spiritual form that has great fruitfulness. That doesn't mean that fruitfulness is universal. It doesn't mean it's universal in time. It doesn't mean it's universal across cultures. So, yeah, it's like, chill. You know, I mean, and it's funny because poets are also a little famous for this. And maybe it's interesting your point about painting. Something tells me, Bear, I mean, you could be right, but something tells me there are people who are saying, if it ain't pointillism, it ain't good. If it ain't your brush strokes of this, and in fact, one of the things that happens too is we see all the time that the new revolution quickly becomes the new dogmatism,
right,
to some people.
And I shouldn't say that that they aren't met with resistance, because they certainly are. I mean, you look at Jackson Pollock or any of any of those artists that broke ground, and went in a totally different direction. They certainly were treated differently and were somewhat overly criticized when they first started off. So I'm definitely not saying that.
And I didn't take you saying that. In fact, I think a great example outside the world of poetry, but one that's very much a parallel, is Freud. I'm fascinated by Freud because Freud clearly revolutionized human understanding of humanity. He was clearly so far ahead of his time that, like you said, he was met with this fierce and sometimes truculent resistance. So what happens when people are in that circumstance? They circle the wagons.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, I was just reading about Irenaeus and the early Christian church. Part of his theology, which led to some of the dogmatism that we often see in certain aspects of Catholicism, came because his church people were being martyred. They were being attacked, and the resistance caused them to harden. So this is a human thing, and it's tough to find that balance sometimes.
Here we are. We've talked so much. I'm actually going to make up a little time and have you read 4 poems.
Oh, sure thing. I'd be happy to. I mentioned earlier that, of course, I would never write a book about the body that didn't include the dark and difficult aspects of it. This poem I'm going to read is part of my family's history. It was a great, horrible, profound tragedy in my family. It was the death of one of my sisters when she was 28. This has been years ago now, from anorexia. The poem is called Anorexia. My sister died when none of us were looking. She'd grown thin as a rake handle, leaf thin, cold as November wind, an autumn world withdrawn into its narrowing self. We were many and loud with desires, a big, happy family, the envy of others, played basketball in our parents' driveway, drank beer and talked long into the night, ate like farm animals. But she'd learned to hate food, to fear it. Slowly became a desperate, impoverished dictatorship, sealing its own borders. She moved to Chicago, left teaching to become a flight attendant, loved us quietly from the distance her new appetite for suffering forced her to, from jet aisles where she served food to strangers, looking appropriately slender in her uniform. We loved the sun, met for family dinners, began producing grandchildren, went camping out under the bright, fertile stars. Forgive us. We didn't want to know how the planets were spinning out of their orbits, drifting, fragmenting, colliding there in her head. I want to read one of those short ones you mentioned. I was raised Catholic, and I am very much a Catholic, not necessarily a traditional Catholic, but I'm very much a world religion kind of person. But I was raised Catholic. My uncle was a priest, and I'm constantly fascinated and plan to write someday about it, about the Catholic world and how it intersects reality, that kind of thing. But here's a short poem called A Catholic Boy. Sister says to fold our hands, to think of God and His Holy Mother, but I'm distracted by the coolness of my palms against each other. Which actually sums up a lot of my early elementary school existence. And I want to read one. There are, not surprisingly, I suppose, a lot of the poems in the book are about sex. I don't think sex has somehow a dominant role in the experience of the body, but it has a great evolutionary power behind it.
It's a biological necessity.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the way we're put together. It certainly is a loud part of our existence, our bodily existence. And to me, one of the things that's fascinating, and again, I grew up in a very repressed time, sexually repressed time, and now our society is experimenting with the other extreme and still not hitting the middle, if you ask me. But for me as a kid, our generation, particularly in the Catholic communities the Catholic community I grew up in Colorado Springs, it was like a huge secret. And when you were a kid, it was kind of a secret anyway, and it was something nobody ever talked about. But clearly, sexuality itself has it manifests itself through almost every aspect of humanity in some ways. So I always thought it was interesting, this whole idea of it being something that was hidden and yet incredibly real and fundamental. So anyway, the poem is called Sex. It's as if the body were a fortress, isolate Ticonderoga, thick-walled, built to withstand. But a spy has come in darkness who knows a secret door, knowing too that a traitor within will welcome him. And once the saboteur has stolen through, has penetrated the great ramparts, the whole fort will shudder to its foundations, even the stones in the walls relieved at finally being breached. We can do a fair amount through symbol, can't we?
Yes. Which is the way they like it here.
Well, and it's interesting too, because one of our
oh my goodness, and actually
please.
To a point, I will just make this in passing. This is the kind of stuff that got Baudelaire's book banished.
Oh, right.
For what, 100 years, because the French couldn't handle this kind of writing.
It's astonishing.
Yeah,
it's astonishing. I mean,
Societies.
the word musk could enrage an entire aspect of society at a certain point. And now, again, I think we're still trying to find the balance. But and finally, let me read another one. I'm constantly amazed in this kind of National Geographic documentary kind of way. I love National Geographic, but at the absolute, almost unimaginable wonder of how the body operates. I mean, the fact that it evolved like it has and the things that go on inside us, the trillion neurons in our head, the roles of chemicals and organs, it's just astounding to me. And one of the things I think is incredibly ironic is that one of our great symbols for death is the skeleton. When you think about it, that's only half true, if it's even half true. So this is called Song to be Sung by a Happy Skeleton. The shy white beast you never see is me. For when beloved flesh is fled, I too am dead. I am the stilts life gave you. I will save you. I dearly hold within my arms the lover who holds his lover. A deeper I am I, a part of all his is, his why. Gaze long into his eyes and you will see how true I am, his deeper other, godly brother. An animal beneath I spring or poise, and every moment mutely to rejoice. If I am death, then death makes living free. I am the hidden white and dancing tree.
All right, we're going to take a break.
Absolutely.
Sorry about that. First thing I need to tell you all is that you're listening to a public radio station. Yeah, I know. I have to tell you this all the time. Because, we're doing poetry and it's just not that painfully obvious. A whole hour every week. But that's not really the point, is it? No. The point is that we are 100% publicly supported. So unlike all our larger cousins out there, here there are no government grants. There is no corporate underwriting. This hour is not brought to you by anyone but you. And if you say, oh, no, I didn't do that, well, you can, you should, you oughta. So you could go to KKUP and become a member of this station. And I say that to you who might be listening live right now, but also to you who might be listening on a podcast somewhere later on, because this is a wonderful station. And you never know. You might move here some years down the line. You might be visiting at some point and want to tune in to KKUP, and it'd be terrible. Just absolutely terrible. Devastating. If it wasn't there for you when you came. So, just something to think about. Plus, this show does not exist unless the radio station is here to make it all happen. So, there you go. You'll want to support the station that's making it happen, right? And we are completely volunteer here. There are no, nobody gets a salary. It's to keep the lights on, keep the equipment running, that kind of stuff. The basics. And we've been doing it for over 40 years, and we would love to go much, much further into the future. But, of course, we're worried about today. And to that point, I say today, go to kkup.org and click on how to become a member. It's very simple.
Bear, can I add a couple of calendar items?
Sure.
These actually aren't poetry, but they're writing things that I'm going to be doing soon. I have you mentioned at the top of the program, my book, Glad to Be Dad, A Call to Fatherhood, is coming out in its print form soon, and I'll be at the Barnes & Noble in Stevens Creek on Thursday, May 23rd at 7. There may be some storytelling involved in that, certainly things from the book. It's a book full of a lot of, now I'm plugging like an old horse, a lot of humor, a lot of family realities. I've got a new children's book out called Down at the Dino Wash Deluxe, and I'll be at Hickleby's on May 9th, Thursday from 3 to 4:30. I very much appreciate you letting me read those on the air. Thank you.
Not a problem. And let's have you read a couple of poems to get us back in the swing of things.
I'd be happy to. It's interesting what you said about the time getting away from us a little, because it's not always in life that you get the chance to talk to somebody. I don't get the chance to talk to people like you that often who know poetry. I'm still blown away at the fact that you that you picked up that Chinese influence, so I can get caught up in the conversation. Obviously, having a body is a serious issue, and there are all kinds of spiritual, philosophical themes and issues that go with it. But one of the things I've read more than once is that it's also kind of funny to have a body. Bodies, for all their burdens and their ecstasies are also funny. So I'm hoping this one is humorous. Obviously, that's for people to decide, not me. Many people know the famous poem by A. E. Housman, To an Athlete Dying Young. The day you won your town the race, they cheered you through the marketplace, which ends with the line, that garland briefer than a girl's. My version is called To an Athlete Dying Slow. The day you missed 4 layups straight and all your teammates had to wait as you came lumbering up the court, feeling fat and slow and short. The younger players looked confused while you stood huffing unamused at your jokes, then shrugged their shoulders, immune, of course, to growing older. They leave the gym and drink all night, while you, your gym shorts feeling tight, prefer just sitting on the couch and reading poems by that guy Houseman, my most famous rhyme. But no one chairs you through the market. Your body aches, you gladly park it in a far less mobile chair. Snacks remote and wassail there. Day by day you inward wail as you stand upon the scale, nor are so swift now o'er the course when troubled by the Charley horse. An athlete now in bleak midwinter, still struggling at the fitness center, slave to fate, taking licks as you approach the river Styx. There was a time when you were fleet, you're wider now in waist and seat, and yet still weakly show the world that jump shot like a little girl's. And would you like another?
Sure.
Okay. I appreciate this. Julia Pastrana was a real person. Clearly, when we talk about the body, one of the things that springs to mind is that the body doesn't always come out right or the way it should or in the normal fashion, however you want to talk about it. And clearly, for centuries, human beings have had various, often troubled and often horrible relationships with those who were disfigured, who had problems with their bodies. Julia Pastrana was a Mexican Native American woman who had I believe I can't remember if this is the actual term, the scientific problem that she had was formerly referred to as hirsutism. Hirsute is a word meaning hairy. She had a full beard. She was covered with hair. She was very prognathous, meaning that her chin jutted forward. And she was treated during the time that she lived, which I believe was around the turn of the century, perhaps earlier, the turn of the 18th to the 1900s. She was treated, as might be imagined, as a freak show person, as there's a lot of tendency in all of us to react that way. But this poem is based on her actual life. The quote at the end is her actual words. There is something to me of just stunning beauty in what this woman carried within her. For Julia Pastrana, you were hideous, bearded, prognathous, your chest and shoulders thick with hair. They called you ape woman, monstrous hybrid, paid good money to stand and stare. You plaited flowers into your curls, danced to an airy and delicate song. Your manager wed you, proceeded to bed you, displayed both your corpse and your son's once you'd gone. And I can't stop hearing what you said at your wedding, though the joy of it bids my heart break. Past the stink of the money and the rude gaping many, he loves me for my own sake. That's very moving to me. It's interesting that you brought up the thing about the disease and the darker side of the body, and yet I feel in reading these, even at the darker points, that there's a subliminal exuberance about nicely
the body.
Put.
I would say celebration, but I think that gets overused. Exuberance is more, I think, to the point. That you're not at any time. You're not, should I say, dissing on the body.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I love that observation because it ties right in with what I sought to do and what kind of instinctively comes to me, I guess, and continues to instinctively come to me. I mean, I'm older now. I don't. when you're young, the body, it's like a high. I mean, you don't always realize it. A lot of times young people don't realize that, but looking back, you can see, and of course there are plenty of young people who have disease and injuries and problems and all that. But when I think of the fact that we live in a physical universe, whatever a person's spiritual stance is, I mean, there are some extreme spiritual ideas that the physical world doesn't exist. I do not hold to those. As Dr. Johnson said once about Bishop Berkeley's monism, he kicked a stone and said, "Berkeley, I refute you." And, that's one of the arguments. But since we're in a physical universe, if you believe in the spiritual, it has to exist somehow in some kind of conjunction with the physical universe. And somehow this physical universe, which began, there's wide agreement among scientists apparently that it began with the Big Bang, this inconceivable event. How any of this came to be from that is just staggering beyond words. But you can see that there had to be a process. Darwin's discovery of evolution was not, it's like the point you made earlier about Baudelaire. Darwin blew the lid off so many people's theological dogmatism, and yet many of us believe that evolution is a profoundly spiritual process at work in a material world. And of course there are arguments back and forth about that. My point, though, is that these bodies came to be. Now, the fact that the body isn't always perfect in it organically seems, when you consider the overall success rate of evolution at producing bodies, and again, Darwin himself disagreed with this in many ways. He saw this as a process of constant death and struggling and suffering. But humanity has this scope to improve things, and that also is due to our evolutionary past. We can make hospitals, we can have neonatal care, we can live more healthy lives. The body is problematic in the universe, and yet it so often works. And many people who have serious disabilities still, there's so much that their bodies do right. I think that's part of the exuberance. And then the rest of it is just this, I can't help feeling incredibly grateful, on a regular way, because I get to experience it. I can feel my elbows on your table. I can feel the air from the fan on my skin, on the back of my neck. It's, when you stop and think about it, it's just astounding. So I guess that accounts for that aspect of the book.
I hate to say it, but let's have you read a couple more poems, because we got to do that. Otherwise, I
don't think that's any problem. I don't want to interpret your statement as like, oh my God, no, he's going to read another poem.
No, I didn't mean that.
I didn't take it that way.
I could talk. We could probably talk for a couple hours and never read a poem.
No, I think you're right. That was my point earlier. It's wonderful. Let me read a poem called "When Daniel Judged Susanna." This is a Old Testament story. Susanna was a beautiful woman, and some old men lusted for her and tried to force her, and she went to the prophet Daniel as a leader. And you'll hear the story in the poem. But one of the reasons I wrote this poem and why this story called to me so much was it's this whole... and again, maybe it's partly a person of my generation, but it's this whole powerful idea that sexuality will out. When we look at what's going on with gay marriage now, I don't see how there's any way the world is possibly going to keep gay people from eventually finding full equality, because human sexuality it's too real not to keep manifesting itself, I guess is one way to say it. So when Daniel judged Susanna, I will not say the prophet was a coarse or venal man. But when the elders had threatened that virtuous woman, whose body even beneath clothing awoke their lust, made them sick with love-longing, when they threatened her unless she submit to them, she refused, accused them in turn. All was brought to the prophet Daniel, on whose judgment Susanna was depending. And standing there before him, she recounted how the old men, peeking hot-eyed through swaying ferns, had watched from green shadows as she bathed, white form in womanly fullness, breasts, hips, eyes dark and beckoning, though she thought she was alone. And Daniel in his wisdom saw through the elders' lies, rebuked them, confined them, restored to her the esteem of the people. I will not say he did less, nor accuse him of hypocrisy or baser motive. Only I find it worthwhile to mention that as he turned to go, he found himself suddenly possessed by a vision of water streaming over her shoulders, her nipples dripping from the arch of a perfect lifted white foot. And for many days this shadowed him with a sweet and continuous trouble. And let me also read, let me see if I've still got my bookmark here. This poem is called In Early Spring. I think it's about sexuality on the surface. It's about sexuality. I don't mean that, but it's also about the body itself and its relationship to the physical universe. I was hiking in a little kind of a mesa area in Colorado Springs, close to the city, very close, but not built up at all, nothing there. And I was walking on a trail where there's a little gravel bank next to me, about 10 feet high, and I saw a dog just come careening out of nowhere, running as fast as he could, crossed the trail about 10 feet ahead of me, and just shot up this gravel bank and disappeared. And I've always remembered this because it was a moment where that dog was absolutely in sync and one with the entire physical universe. Being a dog, just total being. And at that moment when I watched him, I felt some of that myself. In early spring, under a whitening curve of moon, he is still plowing. Is so bone-weary, so plodding, field mud to the ankles, that he dozes as he walks, as the check lines lurch at his back to the grunts of the animal. But in his mind now, so close to sleep, there is no blade to thrust the earth aside, no worn grained handles, no trickling sweat or sharp low whistle, no gathered haunches driving forward. Suddenly there is a dream. He is running his hands over a woman's willing body, and she trembles. She is good to smell, and bright moon eyes shine in gradual glimmering through woods, through her dark hair, and gathered haunches drive forward into orgasms of wheat and rye and violets. Suddenly, middle of that yet bare field, he jerks awake.
I have to ask because you are an author of children's books and of young adolescent books, which not so bad, but the children's books. I have to ask: do you cringe at the thought that maybe somebody sees your name and they pick up this book? And
Do you know, this is actually a very good practical question. I was in a critique group once with a woman, a wonderful writer, and she wrote young adult fantasy fiction, and also wanted to write an adult piece that was much more frank and open about sexuality and violence and other issues. And she was worried, and I remember she expressed this, well, what if people... And my thought is, oh my goodness, don't put me in a box like that. I think children should not... people always say, and I'm one of the people who say I'm against censorship, and I am. But if we're honest about language, about semantics, there is an acceptable censorship for children, young children, for plenty of things in life. There are plenty of things that are too much for them to handle. So the last thing I want is for a child, for example, to read an adult book of mine that has some obviously sexual poetry in it. I'm much more worried about children being exposed to violence on the daily basis that they are. But obviously sexuality can also be violent, and it's often construed and presented in ways that are, to me, really, really wrong and potentially harmful for kids. However, for one thing, I don't think any kid is going to have a problem with this book. They'd be 2 sentences in and they'd say, please give me a fruit roll-up. I don't know what this is about. But I also think it's important that human beings seek fullness, and that our fulfillment as human beings has to do with us as parents and protectors of the young and teachers, as well as artists and lovers and philosophers and all the rest. So I hope that isn't an issue. My website has it all. I have it separated, so there's a place to go to for children's writing and a place for adult writing. And of course, I hope that parents will exercise their caution. But I have a feeling too, even... I would have to say, my wife and I were very honest with our children about, for example, sexuality as they were growing up. And I think that's part of a very healthy, very responsibility-based, a very, I guess I would say, spiritual, ethical approach to sexuality. So I hope that answers the question, but it's a good practical question.
No, the thing is that as a poet, I feel the same way about just in words in general. That there's a responsibility there to show
Yes.
how words get used correctly,
Yes.
and how they can be used incorrectly, and that doesn't just necessarily go to the forbidden taboo words
Exactly.
in our society, which are drummed up anyways. I mean,
Right.
I've always asserted that they're spelled the same way phonetically. You sound them out the same way. There's no difference, as far as the actual spelling and use of these words. They're nouns and adjectives, and with that regard, there's no difference at all.
Right.
It's just what Hayakawa used to refer to as the implied, thing that goes off in your head that makes them either bad, good, indifferent, whatever, and it's all in your own head. And it's hard to cater, because, one man's whatever is another man's,
Sure.
completely different. So you have to, there's no way of getting around that.
And I agree with that too. And I also think there's a role here for courtesy. So, for example, I believe in a society, and the more I see around the world today of censorship and horrible political oppression and other cultural oppression, the more I believe in American freedom of expression, and the rest of it. But I also don't think that there's any need for me. At times, there is a need to get up in people's faces through ethical civil disobedience about important issues regarding, for example, censorship of language. I also don't need to be discourteous and slam my language down somebody's throats, or more appropriately into their ears, unless there's a real need for that. So I think that's part of it too. Civil
and
discourse.
I always believe that an expletive has an incredible weight to it.
Yes.
And that, when it's used correctly, and I'm not saying that everybody does use it correctly, but when it is used correctly, it wakes somebody up.
Absolutely. Well, in fact,
right into it.
there are some, in my opinion, there are some absolutely poetical uses of expletives. But I'm also with you, and this, I think, is one of the problems of keeping too much of this away from kids as they grow up.
Yeah.
Expletives and obscene language are misused on a massive scale.
Yeah.
They become mere, stopgaps or mere habits of language. They're terribly unimaginative. They're kind of pounded into people's ears. It's not that I think parents should teach children how to swear in a colorful way, but I think parents actually have to have discussions with kids about the basic linguistic thing. What's appropriate language, and why is it appropriate, and why are words used in certain ways and other ways? I think that's really important.
You know what? Those words wouldn't exist. See, this is my whole thing. A word exists for a reason.
Right.
And you cannot get away from that. And it has nothing to do with vulgarity or any of that stuff, because I can be the most vulgar person and never say anything that is out of bounds.
Exactly. And those words are taken as symbols of vulgarity when they are not always used as vulgarity.
That's right.
Well, and it's like ain't a word. I love this sentence because it's self-contradictory. Ain't is a word. It may not be a word that you like, but it's there because it exists for a reason, just like you said.
Right, and I use the
it's
word
a dialect
dis.
item. Yeah,
which,
right.
Which, hey.
How crude of you, Bear.
Exactly. Because I was obviously too lazy to use disrespect.
Well, dis has a great flavor. I mean, that's one of the things that's beautiful about language that poets love, is language constantly evolves. I have a 21-year-old daughter and 2 sons in their early 30s, and the language that comes to me from them, my wife and I are constantly collecting all these new things. She heard a Texasism the other day. In fact, I think she saw it in the Mercury News. And we lived in Texas for a while in Austin. It's like the weather is so bad, the drought has lasted so long that the trees are begging the dogs to stop by. I mean, you could use a crude expletive there, but that is so much more colorful, and it can be quite vulgar if you want to make it, if you want to look at it that way.
All right, let's finish up and have you read a couple more poems.
Okay, I'll be happy to. Like you say, I could just go on and on talking to you. Another thing I think is just unbelievably fascinating to me is that, again, this physical universe out of which we evolved, that our bodies, I'm sitting here, every one of us whose breathing is here because of these processes that covered millions of years. I'm fascinated by carbon. So I'm not a scientist or anything, but the fact that we are carbon-based life forms, and of course, a lot of us think of things like that as being really boring. Okay, carbon, whatever. Think of what carbon means in humanity. So I've written what I call Hymn to Carbon. Oh, you run dancing through all my cells, spinning yourself out in this vast, strict flowing of miracles that I am. Oh, simple made many, wild, intricate, pure and prime as the number one, yet multiple. Naming myself, I number blood, bones, flesh, heart, mind, but you run deeper than these, far deeper in all that I am or do, root of the roots of myself and of selves uncountable. You are the inconceivable Brahman down in my joy at lovemaking. You the seminal smoke of my anger, core of my reverence, power beneath my muscles as they thrill to their special electricity. Beneath my kindness, my memory of words or faces, my waking, my sleep, there at the very tick of the voicelessness saying, me. I'll offer you prayers, wine, flowers, as from existence itself you draw out such music as is my being, such billion inwoven melodies, bonding, forming chains and rings, as if running your tireless fingers over unimaginable instruments.
We got time for a really short one.
Okay, let's do a really short one. Wait, I have a really short one here. Oh, okay. Let's end on another Catholic boy poem. Catholic boys in 1965. We were raised on words from church, enjoined in our touch football days to shape our thoughts to God and higher things, but had to find in some odd corner of the house with no one home our angels in the catalogs, sleepwear, and lingerie.
Okay, and in case you tuned in a little bit late, my guest is Tim J. Myers. His book is Dear Beast Loveliness, Poems of the Body, and it's out by Blaze Vox Press. Tim, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
JP, my only regret is that I didn't get to read the poem I brought, which is a beautiful little poem called Still Life with Suicide Bomber 1 by JP Dancing Bear. I love it.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to strike the set, call it a wrap. We'll be back next week. Here's a little something just to play you on out.